For much of the last century, we viewed Cro-Magnons, the earliest modern humans in Europe, as noble and enlightened beings. Their cave art moved us. Their burial rituals seemed almost spiritual. They felt familiar, like echoes of our better selves. It was comforting to believe that the roots of humanity were grounded in beauty and thoughtfulness. But new evidence urges us to reconsider. What if the same hands that etched majestic animals into stone also wielded weapons in the dark? What if the flowers buried with the dead came after violence, not peace? We've long embraced the image of Cro-Magnons as visionaries, but behind the art and bones, there may be another story, one, not of grace, but of grit, a story of competition, of conquest. And maybe, just maybe, that story is even more human. The Cro-Magnons were not some distant species, they were early Homo sapiens, just like us. They arrived in Ice Age Europe nearly 45,000 years ago, and while their bones match ours, their lives were forged in a world far harsher than our own. These were not gentle thinkers wandering through meadows. They were tall, powerful, and built for endurance, adapted to track prey for days, to fight, and to survive. Compared to the stocky Neanderthals or the smaller Homo floresiensis, Cro-Magnons were giants both in size and ambition. While they shared the earth with other human cousins, they didn't share it for long. Whether by competition, conflict, or sheer persistence, Cro-Magnons came to dominate. And while we often remember them for art and innovation, we must also ask, was their greatest strength not creativity, but conquest? When the Cro-Magnons arrived in Europe, they didn't step into silence. The land was already alive with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other early humans who had called it home for hundreds of thousands of years. Yet something changed, swiftly and dramatically. The tools of Neanderthals vanish from the record. Hearths are left cold. The bones of hunted animals shift in kind and pattern. These were not gradual cultural evolutions, they were breaks. Clear, jarring interruptions. Something had happened, or rather, someone. Cro-Magnons didn't simply move in. They displaced, replaced, erased. Whether through conflict, competition, or sheer force of will, they rose and others fell. This was not just migration, it was the beginning of dominance. A quiet, ancient conquest, played out not in cities or scripts, but in fire and bone. For years, we wondered, how could a species so resilient, so deeply rooted in Europe, vanish so completely? The Neanderthals weren't weak. They hunted, built shelters, buried their dead. Yet within a few thousand years of Cro-Magnon arrival, they were gone. Theories once pointed to climate or disease, but the evidence tells a colder truth. Skeletons with trauma wounds, campsites razed, layers of ash where homes once stood. Not a single war, but relentless waves of pressure. Cro-Magnons, with sharper tools and more coordinated tactics, slowly encroached on Neanderthal lands, pushing them back, group by group, valley by valley. It may not have looked like war as we know it, but it was conquest all the same. In time, there was no edge left to retreat to. The Neanderthals didn't just disappear, they were outmatched and overwhelmed. In times of desperation, humans have always done what they must to survive. But some evidence from the Cro-Magnon world suggests this wasn't just about hunger. At Gough's Cave in England, bones tell a disturbing story. Human remains deliberately butchered, cleaned of flesh, skulls reshaped into bowls. The marks are precise, not frantic. This wasn't chaos. It was ritual, it was practiced, and perhaps it was personal. These weren't the bones of strangers. They may have been rivals or kin. Cro-Magnons may have consumed the bodies of enemies to dishonor them, or of their own dead, in ancient rites now lost to time. Was it fear? Was it power? We may never know. But it challenges the image of the Cro-Magnon as merely noble. Beneath the paintings and tools, there may have been ceremony not of art, but of flesh and fire. Across the burial grounds of our Cro-Magnon ancestors, a pattern emerges sown that speaks not through what is found, but through what is missing. Women, especially young women. Their absence is not a matter of chance. It's too consistent, too widespread. Archaeologists are left with troubling questions. Where did they go, and why aren't they buried beside their families? One haunting theory suggests that Cro-Magnon groups may have raided neighboring bands, killing the men and taking the women as captives. It's a pattern seen throughout recorded history, from tribal warfare to empires. But this would place its roots over 40,000 years ago. If true, it means that even in our earliest days, we were not only survivors, we were strategists, and at times aggressors. And that the history of women in war may be far older than we ever imagined. The Cro-Magnons were not merely hunters, they were tacticians, engineers of survival. Their tools, once thought to be made solely for hunting animals, reveal a more complex and unsettling purpose. Spear points, chipped with deadly precision, bows designed for range and power, weighted projectiles thrown with devastating force. These were not crude instruments of chance, they were weapons of choice. And their targets weren't always beasts of the forest. In many archaeological sites, we find signs that these tools were turned against other human rival groups competing for territory, for mates, for resources. The Cro-Magnon toolkit evolved with a focus on efficiency not just in the hunt, but in the conquest. Warfare, it seems, was not born in cities. It may have begun in icy valleys and ancient forests where the first humans learned to kill each other. For generations, we've looked at Paleolithic cave art with awe, marveling at the skill, the grace, the mystery. Herds of bison, silhouettes of mammoths, handprints pressed into stone like ghostly signatures. We call it art. But what if we're only seeing part of the message? Some images are harder to romanticize: figures pierced with arrows, scenes of pursuit, even apparent executions. Could these paintings have served a different purpose? Not as decoration, but as declaration? Warnings to trespassers, memorials of conquest, claims to territory etched into the earth itself. A 30,000-year-old image of a dying man may not be a myth, it may be a memory. A massacre turned into symbol. And if that's true, then cave walls weren't just canvases. They were the first billboards of human power. It's uncomfortable to imagine, but history rarely offers comfort. Some anthropologists now believe that the Cro-Magnons, our own ancient ancestors, may have engaged in early forms of tribal exclusion. Not based on race, a concept that hadn't yet formed, but on identity, on who belonged and who didn't. In a world divided by valleys and language, a stranger wasn't just unknown, they were a threat. And so, bands of humans may have hunted not just animals or enemies in war, but outsiders. Those who looked different, spoke differently, or followed other rituals. It wasn't ideology, it was instinct. But the pattern is hauntingly familiar. Us versus them. It echoes through time, from ancient hillsides to modern headlines. And if it began here, with sharpened flint and firelit eyes, it forces us to ask, how far have we truly come? Buried beneath layers of soil and time, the bones of Cro-Magnon children whisper of a harsh beginning. Healed fractures, stunted limbs, signs of malnutrition etched into growing frames. These were not the wounds of play, they were the scars of survival. These children came of age in a world where scarcity was constant and safety was earned if ever granted. Their days were shaped by hunger, by cold, and possibly by bloodshed. What did they see? A father felled by a rival spear? A village scattered by fear? When violence is all you've ever known, what does adulthood become? These weren't the wide-eyed innocence of modern memory. They were the first witnesses to human conflict. And from that crucible, they grew into warriors, into survivors, into the architects of the world we would inherit. Today, we understand trauma as something real, something carried not just in the mind, but in the body, in the blood. but what of our ancient ancestors? The Cro-Magnons lived through things we can scarcely imagine: bitter winters, sudden violence, the loss of loved ones not to time but to blades. Did they grieve? Did they flinch at the crackle of fire, remembering raids? Did they whisper stories of death to children too young to understand but old enough to carry fear? The brain they carried is the same we carry now. And if we know trauma leaves marks, we must wonder, did it leave its first imprint there? In a world of survival, was fear passed down not just through stories, but through silence? Perhaps, in their bones, in their dreams, the very first shadows of human sorrow began. By 10,000 BC, the world looked very different. The Neanderthals were gone. The Denisovans had disappeared into genetic shadows. Other early human cousins had vanished without a trace. Only the Cro-Magnons remained. They hadn't simply survived, they had emerged as the dominant force. They outthought, outfought, and outnumbered every rival. What began as competition became conquest. They spread across continents, reshaping the human story in their image. The age of many became the age of one. Coexistence, whatever fragile balance once existed, was over. In its place rose a new kind of human dominance. From those who painted the caves and wielded sharpened flint came the first conquerors. And with them, the seeds of everything we would become: our wonders, our empires, our wars. The legacy of Cro-Magnon was not just endurance, it was supremacy. We like to think we've evolved beyond our past, that technology, society, and reason have lifted us above our primitive roots. But if the Cro-Magnons were our ancestors in body, were they also our ancestors in spirit? If they conquered, excluded, and consumed, can we honestly say we haven't done the same, only with sharper tools and grander justifications? Perhaps the wars we wage today, the borders we draw, the fears we harbor, they aren't modern at all. Perhaps they're echoes, genetic memories. What if we haven't escaped their instincts but simply refined them? Are we more enlightened or just more efficient? It's not a comfortable question, but it may be the most honest one we can ask. Because sometimes, to understand where we're going, we have to look back and ask whether we're still carrying the shadows of who we once were. With each passing year, the ground offers us new voice bones long buried, tools once held by hands like ours, and each discovery reshapes what we thought we understood. Cro-Magnons were not simple. They were not just painters in caves or hunters of mammoth. They were complex, layered, and at times terrifying. They created beauty, yes, but they also brought destruction. They journeyed across continents, but in their wake, others disappeared. They built, they erased. The more we dig, the more contradictions we uncover. They were us at our most curious and at our most cruel. The fossil record is not a dry archive. It breathes, it whispers, and in those whispers, we hear not just history, but warning. Because the story of the Cro-Magnons is not finished, it continues in us. The Cro-Magnons left no written language, no cities, no monuments carved in stone, but their legacy is everywhere in our bones, our behavior, our fears. They shaped the world not only with tools, but with choices, with dominance, with silence. They were not monsters, no, but neither were they saints. They were human, raw, unfiltered, and unflinching. In them, we see the blueprint of both creation and destruction. Their hands lit the first fires and raised the first weapons. And though they vanished in name, their shadow never left. It stretches across every battlefield, every act of conquest, every quiet decision made from fear instead of hope. To know them is not to judge them. It is to recognize the mean ourselves, because their story didn't end in the Ice Age. It still walks with us. If this story challenged you, stay with us. At Prehistoric Shadows, we uncover the forgotten truths of ancient humanity, those buried beneath rock, time, and myth. Because if we don't tell these stories, no one will. subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. Because history didn't just happen, it's still with us.